Hi everyone, welcome to this short video presentation on Zizioulas, being as communion, the final two chapters, 6 and 7. Chapter 6, entitled Ministry and Communion. And then chapter 7, we have the local church in a perspective of communion. So we see the common word here, communion. Again, similar to Ratzinger's book, called to communion. This concept of communion is so key for us today. We think of, again, Pope St. John Paul II's theology of the body, a key word there too. We have to be mindful that in the 20th century there was something in Western philosophy called the personalist movement. And it involved many different thinkers, but people who became more attentive to the meaning of human personhood and the dignity of the person, and this universal call to form a communion of persons as the meaning of being human. It's very beautiful, very necessary. Instead of understanding ourselves as these individual automatons that are deterministic and mechanical and technological, but instead of real incarnate understanding of being human and the meaning of the body in reference to its own sacramental proclamation and manifestation of this call to communion. Being male and female, for example, means I don't represent the totality of humanity as one or the other, but only half, only parts. And my body is in reference to another kind of body. And these bodies together, in their sexual complementarity and unity, especially on display in the sacrament of marriage between husband and wife, but in any case, just the complementarity between male and female in general, in terms of personhood, in terms of body and souls, altogether, is the revelation of the imago Dei, not just the individual person as male or female, but male and female in relation forms this communion of persons, which itself is the fullness of the imago Dei, John Paul II says in Theology of the Body. So Zizioulas, many similar tones and tropes, you could say, talks about this primacy of communion. Also similar to Ratzinger in this chapter 6, page 210, that there's no ministry in the church other than that of Christ. And that to minister in the church means to share in the ministry of Christ and His will and His methods, His way of doing things, which are many and varied overall, we could say. But at the same time, there's a fidelity to the one thing necessary in following Christ, as He says to the sisters Martha and Mary. Mary has chosen the better part, sitting at His feet, it shall not be taken from her. The better parts are also sometimes put the unum necessarium, the one thing necessary. And by keeping this before us, in front of us at all times, we share in the ministry of Christ and don't make up our own plans and agendas along the way. So Christology must be conditioned by pneumatology in this sense. God the Holy Spirit being not only inspired by, but animated by, again, from the inside out of God the Holy Spirit, keeps us in the ministry of Christ. Page 212, God the Holy Spirit is constitutive of the very relation between Christ and ministry. We should not envision ministry apart from the concrete community of the local church, which authentic ministry is brought about by the koinonia of the Spirit. And this beautiful Greek word, koinonia, which we could translate as communion, fellowship, participation. And that's important to think about in ministry in a local church, especially as a pastoral servant leader in ministry. We can have what we think are pretty good ideas to see through. And sometimes yes, sometimes no. But what we have to do is study the local community, the local culture, to help to empower different members of the local community in order to move toward a greater unity and a greater inclusivity within the local community, inviting people into the church through evangelization, through catechesis, through outreach, making the church accessible to different people with various disabilities and diverse makeups and things. A lot of people struggle with mental illness, and we have to find a way to welcome, to be hospitable, to always be mindful of the dignity of the human person. This movement toward koinonia, that is patient, that is forbearing, that loves through difficult things. So this must be thought of not only in terms of clerical ordination, but also in terms of the variety of charisms and apostolates in the church that have their origin in the ordination, quote unquote, of baptism and confirmation through the sfragis, the seal. Sfragis, the Greek word for to be sealed with the gift of the Holy Spirit. All the faithful, clergy and laity alike, have this gift, this privilege. Page 217, this paradox that Zizioulas says the Holy Spirit unites only by dividing. Pope Francis has said this too in the past. And what he means by that is that we need a plurality of parts in order to move toward unity. So there's a difference between plurality and division, per se. So the Holy Spirit unites by dividing is simply referring to the clarification of the plurality of members, charisms, apostolates, that the Holy Spirit leads and guides in order for there to be a greater unity of the church. We think of this, for example, with religious orders. There's not only the Benedictines, as wonderful as the Benedictines are, for example, and there's a variety, there's a family tree of Benedictine religious orders, the Cistercians, the Carthusians, the Trappists, and so on. But there's also the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Carmelites, the Jesuits, the Augustinians, the Spiritans, the list goes on. And we sense that. That's a good thing. That's beautiful. When the church is really diverse in this plurality of parts, what the potential that's there is to come together as a greater unity. As that unity itself is magnified to the degree of this plurality of parts that's being unified. Because if it was just all the same, it wouldn't be unity, it would be just strict uniformity. If it was just a couple things being united here in this global church, it'd be, okay, they're getting along, maybe they're just coexisting. But for there to be such a plurality of parts, it's all the more amazing. It's all the more wonderful. St. Thomas Aquinas says, this is why God creates such a diversity of creatures, to show forth all the more the divine glory, the divine master artist. This is the difference between true art and manufacturing. In true art, there's a wonderful creativity, there's an unpredictability, but altogether there's still meant to be this movement that unites, this shared experience of beauty, for example, that we all can say, wow, oh my goodness, amazing. And so when we talk about, for example, the classic three Platonic transcendentals, which are truth, goodness, and beauty, there is meant to be a unity of these. There's no truth without goodness and beauty. There's no goodness without truth and beauty. There's no beauty without truth and goodness. There's a loving unity among these things. Again, another instance of a Trinitarian form in the order of creation: truth, goodness, beauty. And there's a complementarity among these things. So when we say the universe, how many diverse things populate this universe? Or we say earth. What makes up earth? Such a rich variety of organisms and types of being, living and non-living. And when we think of the communion of saints, as St. Edith Stein says, this image of heaven is like each of us inserted as a unique and unrepeatable flower in this eternally imperishable wreath. But it's still one wreath. There's still a unity here. Think of a garden with all the varieties of flowers. If there's just one type of flower, okay, that's nice. But when you have a rich variety, it's like, cornucopia. Think of a meal. We could go on and on with this truth. But a meal that it's not all just French fries. It's a variety of dishes, like a really good meal. There's a variety of things to try, and in even small quantities, we enjoy it all the more, not in a gluttonous, piggy way, but in a way that respects that rich variety of every dish, and we celebrate like this. So this is what it's getting at. And the same thing when it comes to races of people, ethnicities, and cultures. So ministry is relational and leads toward in-person sacramental communion of persons. Page 224. There should be no dichotomy assumed between the world out there and the church in here. It's a really interesting challenge. A lot of times we draw such a sharp distinction between something like the sacred and the profane, and we can get a kind of siege mentality developing that we're going to keep everything profane out of the sacred. But why does the church exist? St. Paul VI said the church exists to evangelize, which is that movement of the sacred going out into the profane and sanctifying it. So if there's no contact between the sacred and profane, there's no chance of sanctifying the profane. So this process whereby God the Holy Spirit wants to go to every hidden corner of the universe to sanctify, to enliven, to transform, to transubstantiate. There must be contact. There must be dialogue. There must be proximity. There must be, especially on the part of the sacred, a hospitality to help the profane become transfigured. Take page 226. This ecstatic nature of ministry and evangelization in terms of overcoming one's selfhood. This is a beautiful concept in so many great philosophers of the 20th century. But the meaning of, in Greek, ekstasis. So stasis, to stand, like to be situated. Out. So it's where we get the word existence, to existere. But ekstasis is that movement where the self forgets itself in movement toward the other, to serve the other, to be responsible for the other, to love the other, whether we're talking about the divine other, the angelic other, the other human facing me. The ecstatic movement of the self as the essence of the missionary mandate of following Christ. When I follow Christ, it means my eyes are on Him. My ears are listening to His voice. And there's a movement of the self outside of itself. And this is when we live our best. When grace comes in and pushes out. When Jesus is walking on the water and St. Peter says, "Bid me, Lord, come to you." And Peter goes out of the boat. This is already an image of evangelization. It's not just about some paranormal phenomenon, though it is rather unusual. But it's this image of, there is the boat, but we go out to bring in. To be a fisher of men, fisher of people, means we have to cast out the net in an ecstatic way. There's an ecstatic casting out of the net. There's an ecstatic casting out of the demon. There's an ecstatic Zacchaeus moment where when Jesus comes into the house, certain things have to leave. Selfishness, pride, envy, all the deadly sins, and we become gifted to live in this newness of life, as St. Paul talks about in Romans 6, page 232. So thinking about especially the sacrament of holy orders here, any isolation of the ordained person from the rest of the members of the body amounts to his death. So when we're ordained to ministry in holy orders, but also that common priesthood through the sacrament of baptism and moreover confirmation, that this being sealed, we're being sealed not to be isolated from each other. If we give into isolation, we die. If the hand is detached from the body and isolated, it's going to die. Any part, the same thing. The part has to remain in the body to be living, to be united to the whole. 236. The unity of a community depends upon the concrete gathering of the persons within the liturgical synaxis, the Eucharistic ordering of existence. And that's the beautiful thing about the Eucharistic liturgy, is we come together to become all the more missionary and go out. So again, the diastolic, breathing in, systolic, going out, just like the human heart. The diastolic, the expansion, the dilation of the chambers. Here comes the blood to be oxygenated, and then the systolic, the contraction, the going out. 247, the Eucharist is Catholic, yet geographically located and concentrated. So the Eucharist in itself is universal. It's the same everywhere where you have a valid Eucharist, valid sacramental Eucharist. It's the same everywhere, but the Eucharist happens locally in this place or that place, geographically. There's a concentration of that inbreaking of God's presence, real presence, that inbreaking of grace, that gathering of the local community, and it has a specialness about it, a uniqueness about it, and that's a good thing. It doesn't contradict the Church Universal, but is part of the greater whole. Page 250. So from an Orthodox perspective, now this is Zizioulas as the Orthodox Patriarch talking, the parish as a presbyterocentric unity is not the full manifestation of the local church. Rather, the concept of the local church is guaranteed by the bishop and not by the presbyter priest. The identity of the local church is rooted more so in the diocese or eparchy rather than the parish or school. So even for Orthodox perspective, the local parish is not, doesn't make the full manifestation of the church. It's the eparchy, and we'd say in the Roman Rite, the diocese, where the seat of the bishop is in this territory, is the fullness of of the church. But again, from a Catholic perspective, we say always in relation to Rome, always in unity with the other dioceses around the world, that the singular diocese is not the complete church. Page 2455, there's a need, nevertheless, for local enculturation and inclusion, a really important point. So for a church to thrive in a given place, the leadership needs to study the local culture, the local people, and how to bring together these different people groups locally into this one family of God. And finally, page 260, a church must incarnate people even more so than ideas or beliefs. The ideas, beliefs, doctrines are for the sake of that collective movement toward interpersonal unity. They're a means to an end. The words are, even when we think of communication, we say a lot of words, we hear a lot of words, we read a lot of words, and it's wonderful. But the Christian concept is, but there is one word, that all the words are supposed to lead us to that living relationship with the Word made flesh.